is Will explicitly trying to bait me into yelling about Nate Silver on this podcast? Because
What
I
is
have
your
been
beef with Nate Silver again?
Hello, and welcome back to What's Left of Philosophy. I am your co-host, William, and I am joined by Gil. Hi, Gil.
Hello. Hello.
Lillian. Hey there.
Hi.
And Owen. How you doing, man?
Hey, Will. How you doing?
So today we're going to be working on British cultural theorist Stuart Hall. I'm personally really excited for this episode because I think if you listen to our first episode, which if you haven't, go quick, listen to it, picks up on a lot of the conversations we were engaging with Althusser. So I wanted to talk about Stuart Hall because I think he gives us, at least for me, two interesting questions to think about. One, he has this return to culture, and he seems to be attending to this difficulty. So what is the relationship of Marxism to culture? What's the relationship of culture to popular struggle, to class struggle? Is culture simply a part of what's called the superstructure? So it's kind of a distraction. He thinks not. And so the first question that it seems like he's trying to attend to is, how does one build popular power? Can one avoid the specificity of culture? And the second question he raises with him, his engagement with thinkers like Gramsci and Althusser is, what methodology should we have as theorists when trying to understand our situation? We need to be able to move through what he calls different levels of abstraction to show how a situation is specific, in other words. And so he calls this conjunctural. And so I was wondering if we could begin this conversation with the question of, so what is culture for Stuart Hall? Is this still workable for us? My initial inclination is to think that, in these lectures we're reading from 1983, culture is about an organization of a pattern of behavior, representations, and lifestyles. And he seems to think that that needs to be the ground from which we start thinking about how do people organize themselves? How do we understand how they need to be organized? What do you all think?
Well, I still think the concept of culture that Stuart Hall uses is helpful because it casts, I think, a wider net than the concept of ideology. Obviously, there's a kind of consonance, right, in the way that he analyzes culture as a kind of, an ideological, a site of ideology, but it doesn't quite completely overlap with ideology. And so I think it's still a helpful category for bringing in phenomena which go beyond just like ideational content, just thoughts, and bringing in a wide set of social practices that form and allow us, or that inform a much more kind of comprehensive and full sense of what's called superstructure in Marxism, right? That which, instead of being epiphenomenal above economics, it actually being a kind of wide and diverse dispositive that, in which a number of different forces meet. So I still think it's useful as a category because of that kind of broadening of the concept of ideology.
Yeah, and I wanted to say this in the beginning because I think that this is the quote that Lillian sent out when we agreed to do Stuart Hall, which is it's this idea that I think when a lot of people think of Stuart Hall, they think he was giving this general theory of culture, but in this lecture in 1983, which we are reading, he writes, quote, "It is important to understand that the concept of culture is proposed not as an answer to some grand theoretical question, but as a response to a very concrete political problem in question. Quote, the question is, what happened to the working class under conditions of economic affluence, end quote. And so I think it also has to be, so what is it that we think culture explains, rather than culture only being like sort of a sociological notion of, look at these people doing these things, rather, can it give us political explanations for why struggle either appears or doesn't appear in specific moments?
Can I ask like a stupid question? No, wait, I'll save my stupid question for after Gil says what he says.
So in that lecture series, right, he kind of gives us like a kind of genealogy or history of like the sources of cultural studies and where these concepts come from. And like he traces it back to literary criticism and sociology and anthropology, but also wants to say that like the way in which it thinks about culture, and he's trying to get us to think about culture, is distinct from the concept of culture that these elaborate. So as you were just saying, right, like this sort of anthropological approach that we get in the early part of the 20th century is as you were just describing, well, just like, look at what these people are doing.
Mm-hmm.
And he's got a much more sort of engaged political and specifically Marxist uptake of this concept. And it's an interesting one insofar as it has to do with trying to account for like the lack or absence of formation of class consciousness and the need to give an account of what's missing from political life or social life, that this kind of cultural account maybe will help be able to provide an answer for. That, as you said, like under conditions of relative affluence, where do these like where do these energies go? How are they dissipated? And it's interesting that he's always insisting on the way in which culture and cultural practices like are and have to always remain contradictory and localized in this sort of conjunctural Gramscian way.
Yeah, that's the part that that's really important to me, because he's not the first person to think about culture through a kind of generally Marxian vein, but I think what distinguishes his work on culture, at least from what I know, I'm still fairly new to Stuart Hall, but what distinguishes it is that it's not just an account of culture as an apparatus of domination. It's exactly what you just said, Gil, right? That culture is a site of contradictory and oftentimes opposing forces, some of them which might have subversive potential, others which might be useful for placating the working class, right? And so that account of culture, which is not just, as you might find in Adorno and Horkheimer, an operator of domination or a site of domination, but a more kind of equivocal site. That makes sense.
Okay, are you guys ready for my stupid question?
Yeah, let's hear it.
Absolutely.
So, what is the big deal about like culture and economy? I read this, like I read Althusser last week, and I had a similar question about Stuart Hall as I did about Althusser. Or no, I had a similar reaction. My reaction was like, this seems like a problem of like 50 years ago. Like this is like a way of talking about this tension between culture and economy. And it strikes me that one has to have a very reductive understanding of the economy in order to get this like problematic that like culture needs to be this thing that we separate out from it in some way, because to avoid economism, like you have to think about them as separate in the first place in order to like derive this problem. In the same way that, like I said, Althusser doesn't know anything about the economy, and therefore we're talking about ideology in this weird way, where ideology is the thing that starts to hold the social structure together. I just have the same thing about question about Stuart Hall. It's like culture becomes the thing that holds the social structure together because we can't possibly explain it via the economy, because the economy isn't behaving in the way that we want it to, or that we thought it should. So instead of interrogating what was wrong with one's understanding with the economy and like adding texture normatively and indeed culturally, it becomes like I never feel quite satisfied with either of these accounts, and I can get into what I think is exciting about Stuart Hall, like maybe a little, but I just wanted to like throw it out there that like my problem with both authors is kind of like, I'm sympathetic, of course. I'm also I think it's kind of a part of the same tradition, except for that Stuart Hall is grappling with like Thatcherite England and this like conservative turn, and this apparent shift in conservative ideology of the working class. But again, instead of being like, the affluence of the working class is somehow detrimental, and so then it must be like, well, we've kind of solved, like class conflict has sort of been resolved in a certain way, and it's like deeper forms. So now we have to interrogate the mindset and the cultural. And then this creates the shift later for people to like take the cultural turn away from thinking about the economy entirely, which Stuart Hall does not himself do. But it does create that opening, because if you stop interrogating the economy as like a live dynamic, as a social practice that has its own cultural things, then it becomes like the economy isn't the problem, culture becomes the problem, and you get this split. Does that make sense? I mean, absolutely. As a question.
Yeah, and he's open about struggling with that culturalist tendency, right? He calls it the tendency toward culturalism instead of a cultural analysis. Yeah,
and the same thing can be said about Althusser. Like the turn to ideology becomes like post-structuralism later. So I just see like there's parallel tracks here happening.
So, yeah, I think for Stuart Hall, I think it would help. For me, what is the specific question he is trying to answer? And it seems to me the turn towards culture is less about class conflict is resolved. So we also, some of us read. I don't know if all of us did. So I'm not trying to put anyone out. But I also assigned this essay called "Political Commitment" from the 1966, and there.
Yeah. By the way, thanks for assigning so much reading.
Here it is. So there.
I did do my homework, by the way.
I read it all, Gil. I don't know about you.
Wow.
I didn't. I don't know how to read.
Okay. your co-host, ladies and gentlemen. There was a joke in the group chat where I, for some reason, felt the need to blow up Gil for assigning so much, and at least I didn't. And while I was doing the reading today, I realized I had signed over 200 pages. So that was a little bit embarrassing for me. I was like, who did this? It was me. But it seems to me that Stuart Hall, he's doing this because, as you said, he's grappling with Thatcherism. But this question is, so why did the left miss? What did they miss? How weren't they speaking to the working class to organize them, to get them to understand and represent to themselves that the class conflict didn't go away? And so in Political Commitment 1966, he's so hard on the Labor Party because they have completely separated out the question of contestation, taking a stand for amelioration, pragmatics, and also, Gil, I thought you enjoyed this. He makes fun of polling and all of that.
Oh my God, yeah. I was reading that. Okay, so there's this bit where he talks about
where he dunks on Nate Silver.
Yeah, and I was like, is Will explicitly trying to bait me into yelling about Nate Silver on this podcast? Because
what is your beef with Nate Silver again? So I mean, I feel like you keep dropping these little tweets, like you and Nate, you're going back and forth with Nate Silver, but let's understand this better.
I think that actually it was really great to read these lines by Stuart Hall, because he almost exactly gets my problem with this way of thinking about politics. And so it's in the Political Commitment essay. Actually, the other thing to say about that essay too is the specific references are to mid 60s United Kingdom. But he could also just be describing where we are today in so many ways, and for precisely the sorts of reasons you were just saying, right? Noticing the sort of failure to treat in actual political terms the sort of issues that are getting co-opted as non-political cultural ones that we see in the Democratic Party as this apparatus for diffusing class antagonism. And so, but the thing about psephology, I have an entire quote pulled here, but it's about what's the function of this sort of pseudoscientific quantitative approach to registering and measuring public opinion as itself an important political praxis. And so what we end up with is, as he puts it, increasing sophistication of method, but each methodological advance has its ideological content, right? And so what do we think we're doing when we develop a new methodology for collating the data sets of the results of various polling sites throughout the country, and then say, okay, that's what we are, that's who we are, that's where we are. This now sets parameters on what we can take seriously as possibility. Whereas, as he points out, what's missing is any idea of praxis, right? And so just for instance, if it were the case, it turns out it's not the case. If it were the case that we took all these polls in the US today and found that the majority of people did not like or did not support something like Medicare for All. The psephology line is, well, then we don't go for it, right? Because it shuts down any idea of transforming the state of consciousness or of political public opinion. It's just a sort of positivist temperature check that I think gets in the way. I mean, this is why we have all these arguments these days about like so-called electability, which are always just based on what people think they would go for if presented an option at the ballot. It's not clear to me that that represents anything. And more importantly, the point has to be to agitate for transforming this public opinion and not just like, I don't know, getting the word on the street about what people think they like. It just seems like a mistake to me. Right? I mean, so like as a quote here, he says, this is on page 88 in the political commitment essay, right? He goes, it's fine. It's one thing to be able to test more accurately the balance of political forces at any one time. It is quite another thing to allow this technique to so dominate the scene that politics itself becomes a question of sampling the state of public opinion as it exists, an elaborate process of echoing back to the electorate what it already knows, sugared, of course, by effective methods of presentation and the right party image. And I was just thinking this whole time about like all these really cool graphs and charts and ways of presenting data that like the 538 people are so proud of. And I'm like, I guess that's fine. But like the point would be to shift the needle and not just like put it in a digestible form.
Okay, so first of all, shout out to Stuart Hall for never accommodating himself to New Labor.
Respect.
That's a badass. So that's a badass thing for a new leftist. Point one. Number two, I feel like what you just described is like the entirety of neoliberal politics. Like one of the reasons Stuart Hall has to start talking like this is because beginning in the Thatcher era and for Reagan in the US, the party of the left, so Labor, starts becoming increasingly separated from the working class, and they start like accommodating themselves to this separation. So one of the reasons today that like opinion polls are so controversial is because no one in the middle class or the elite political class or the middle class or the academic class, whatever, like the people who run the opinions of this country, no one knows what the hell working class people think, and that's a huge problem. So like, I think Stuart Hall is, he sees this problem. I mean, and he goes at it by way of like articulating a way of thinking about culture. But what I'm hearing from what you're saying is that he sees this problem and in his own ways, describing this problem in his kind of like theoretical language, and he sees it as a political problem from the beginning, which is very, very astute, I would say, because now we're all like, I feel like it took us all like 50 years to be like, no, the problem is the left separation from the working class. Like this is the primary, there's a lot of other structural problems, but if we're going to make any progress, this is like problem number one.
I think that's exactly his position, that, you know, the reason why we could say the struggle failed is that the left began separating itself from, you know, the patterns of behavior, the ways of living of the working class. So it could not actually understand from within what were the desires, what were the attachments, what was wanted. And I imagine, I don't know very much about the people he's arguing with, but he's definitely arguing against people who are making the claim like something must have gone wrong in our theory because economically the struggle should have happened. And he's saying, as almost like all Marxists would say, this isn't like an absolute mechanism. It's not like one thing happens, another thing happens, socialism. And so he is asking, like, so how did you all miss that this phenomena could occur? That, how did you all miss what was new about the situation? And what partially was new is your separation from the actual ferment of social practices of the working class. So you no longer, to put it rather bluntly, spoke their language. Your interests, couldn't even see that your interests were diverging because you weren't in touch.
Yeah, and so like what's interesting then is that like this sort of what I'm again I guess polemically calling like pseudoscientific methodology allows for this sort of very savvy political class to think that it is still somehow in touch with and registering the opinions of the working class, so to speak. And yet, like, it's a distortion in important ways. And I think, again, like, more importantly, mistaking the understanding of what social consciousness looks like as though that were the political project, which is to foment, to induce, to try to create and nurture social consciousness. Right?
Well, look at the way that those things like 538 talk about identity, right? Like they talk about, they have this term that they use with demographics as destiny. And, even after the last election, they're really confused by certain voting patterns because they're working with a concept of identity that is totally unmoored from material or class conditions.
Well, not only 538, the Democratic Party is completely confused.
Yeah, Democratic Party gets all of its
they
tips.
seem really confused. And then because they're confused, they're like, because they're confused, then they're like, oh my God, we did so well. Where like they have to kind of cover up their confusion on like their various medias and like posture, like they've done, like their strategy worked or whatever, because they like can't explain basically anything about what just happened.
Yeah, but Stuart Hall like specifically points to the dangers of separating identity from what he calls the symbolic and material support of identity. And so he's quite specific about that.
Yeah, and I think also what he gives us to understand is also, and I think this is so important. I always try to talk to my students about this. What might have worked yesterday doesn't mean it's going to work today. And so I think sometimes, let's say in the United States, people essentialize or homogenize the civil rights movement. They're like, so Black people are universally on the side of either the Democratic Party or saving the country or anything like that. But there isn't this conjunctural analysis of, so there might be multiple forces at play that you need to organize in order for this to become a coherent political bloc. But instead, you mythologize identity as if political positions naturally follow, and you haven't paid attention to the way the terrain has shifted. And so it seems to me what Stuart Hall is trying to say is, it's actually important. So I wonder what you all think about this. There is, in a way, we're talking about Stuart Hall generally, but he's so into specifics, and he's trying to say that your theory needs to be able to adequately understand when it's being, really concrete and specific, when, it, is making sort of, it's offering sort of general concepts to allow you to understand your way around. But it seems to me he's constantly saying, well, we need to pay attention to, I have it written down here in another of his essays. It's the Gramsci one. We need to understand the historical conditions of theoretical production. And that means that you have to constantly reassess and return to your context if you're going to understand what a productive or progressive political practice would be.
Yeah, and this is why, like, one of the reasons why he's so drawn to Gramsci, right? He says, listen, like, Marx gave us an analysis of capitalism at its highest level of analytical abstraction. But what he seems to be drawn to about Gramsci is that Gramsci is such a kind of his problematics are so specific to his particular social, political, historical conjuncture, right? National unity of Italy, creating a party, a communist party, which is capable of actually, exercising effective power, the relationship between the south and the north of Italy, and all of these very specific questions which animate Gramsci's work, and which he says, like, look, it still gives us a lot to draw from for, conclusions we might draw about other contexts. But, what he finds like so compelling in Gramsci's work, and I like the way that he frames this relationship between Marx and Gramsci, right? One at the heights of analytical abstraction, and the other at, so to speak, right, the lowest level of kind of regionally, culturally, historically specific analysis of like what's at stake here, what are the various social alliances at play, how do we actually leverage a working class party when it's up against these particular obstacles, specific obstacles that we face, both at the level of the state, civil society, and the economy. And yeah, so I like the way he frames that kind of comparison between highest level of analytical abstraction and then kind of on the ground, social analysis.
Yeah.
Yeah, he says in one of the lectures that because he's such a conjunctural thinker who's like so intimately concerned with like precisely these like actually existing relations of tension and ideological kind of conflict and contestation that Gramsci sometimes looks too concrete. Like, is it like transferable even?
Yeah,
right? Can we even learn from something that's that wedded to a particular analysis? And so he wants to draw from that a kind of methodological approach, which he thinks is different than what he sees going on in Althusser and in Poulantzas's reading of Gramsci, which he thinks is just trying to like, all right, well, it was too concrete, so let's like make it abstract again. Let's like re-theorize Gramsci, but that kind of misses the point and power of his specific kind of analysis, which is what he's trying to repeat in these various contexts. Like the essay, one of the other essays that we looked at was "What is this black in Black popular culture?" from 1992, and I was thinking about what you were just saying, Will. This like the reification of these like identity categories. Like he says, yeah, you end up when you start thinking that there is a kind of destiny to any particular mode of identification that like you can only go astray, right? Like, and so the specific examples he's giving and thinking about are, why would we assume that there is an automatically either progressive or even specifically anti-racist character to Black identity formation in early 90s British social life. And here's a quote. He says, it naturalizes and dehistoricizes these differences along whatever axis we're looking at, right? Ethnic, racial, gender, class differences, naturalizes and dehistoricizes them. And he says, quote, once we've fixed it, we're tempted to use, quote, black as in itself sufficient to guarantee the progressive character of the politics we fight under that banner, as though that's like the only axis along which we might register something like the difference between progressive or reactionary, or also that that it would have this sort of automatism to it at all, right? That it would automatically go in the direction of a progressive bent, if not for these other complicating contradictions. Because again, he thinks it's always overdetermined, right? Specific subject positions.
I want to, return to what I take to be kind of the second part of Lillian's question, which is whether Stuart Hall opens the door to the, culturalism. I think in our day, we endlessly, especially if you're on Twitter, see the kind of, the fight between what's probably pejoratively called cultural politics and what's understood as real politics. And I take cultural politics to be about politics of representation, the idea that we want a ruling class that looks more like us rather than actually we might not want,
No one ever actually admits that, though.
Actually holds that
I
position,
feel like
right?
No, I think people do, but no one will. I mean, I'm happy to accuse somebody
Hillary
of holding
Clinton,
that position, but I don't think people admit it. I think it's kind of like we all know it's there, but nobody wants to
say
own it.
Well,
Clinton promised gender parity on the Goldman Sachs board, though. So,
well, apparently some will admit it.
That's why the Democrats won, right? They had such a well-balanced ticket: old white man, young black woman. You get the whole field of forces.
There you go.
Democrats
crushed it.
Yeah.
And this clearly was satisfying to the general population. So
demographics are destiny, Lillian.
Yeah.
Just look at Southern Texas.
Full circle.
Wow,
Full circle.
Too soon, Owen. Too soon. You're gonna hurt their feelings. Well, but my question is this: so if we push deeper into that kind of the weeds of what Hall is saying, is one, how is what he's saying not cultural politics in terms of how is he not just talking? I assume he's not. How is he not just talking about, well, we need better representation, and so in some ways I wonder if we have developed a different understanding of culture than Hall has back in the 1980s. And two, I'm wondering what you all think about what I guess Hall implies, the relationship of the ruling class to culture. So does the ruling class make use of culture to form, and I think this is more in the Gramsci essay, more of a political bloc rather than it's just one class ruling? And so what I take him to be saying is, holding together a rather contradictory coalition in order to secure what he calls hegemony, which isn't strictly coercion, but almost me reductively setting the terms of the debate.
Yes,
being
exactly.
like, here's the bandwidth you can operate in. And so I guess like I kind of want to address that worry, because I think a lot of people, when they hear culture, they're hearing cultural politics in the pejorative sense. And I'm wondering, does Hall get out of that, or does he not?
So one thing that's interesting is like in none of the pieces that we looked at, which is like, spanning 20 years of his like theoretical career, like he almost never uses the language of representation, which I think you're right, like is like this like way in which we tend to automatically assume is meant by cultural politics or this like culturalist turn. Like he's not talking about that at all, as far as I can tell. I think it is much more like you said, like, and this is one of the other things that he gets from Gramsci, has to do with hegemony. And so like, by which we mean, I think, like you said, like setting the terms of the debate. Like hegemony isn't necessarily about just like clamping down on all possible forms of thought, but rather establishing a dominant common sense, right? The frame within which discussions happen or are possible, what the sort of norms of intelligibility are. And that's the level at which I think he's right to say things like that. We can have these like local victories or like, make small steps in a progressive direction. But we still will need at a certain point, in order for this to be lasting and effective, to develop a counter-hegemonic sort of way of thinking and to sort of try to make that part of the political struggle itself. He writes, this is on from like the last lecture in the 1983 book. It's on pages like 189. He says, quote, "While cultural politics and ideological struggle are not sufficient in themselves to restructure the social formation, right, there can be no sustained establishment of counter-hegemonies without their articulations in culture and ideology. Cultural politics and ideological struggle are the necessary conditions for forms of social and political struggle." And so like, I don't, none of that sounds at all about like, these questions of like, representation of minorities or anything like that, or even like the sorts of political struggles that get cashed out sometimes, I think wrongly, as cultural ones, say, for instance, over the right to abortion. This has to do with the development of ways of thinking and of expressing what it is that's being demanded that are broadly foreclosed by the kind of the dominant field of the thinkable, so to speak.
I mean, what's crazy is I'm not even sure we have that now. Like, I don't, talking about abortion seems like something that isn't like even like the Democratic Party has like given up, so like I didn't hear anything about abortion in this particular election. But I want to make a point with that because so I feel like Stuart Hall, like these readings made me think so much about just the difference, the continuity and difference between his political moment and ours. So to me, the reason that it seems really viable to kind of like start to emphasize culture, not because I really don't think it's because he wants to leave the material conditions behind. That's so not his agenda. But it seems viable to kind of start this kind of cultural critique in this area of inquiry, both because he feels like it's been neglected, but because the New Left created cultural space. And he sees it as a terrain, like a frontier, if you will, of some kind. Like in 2020, I feel like we can't have an honest conversation about social policy to save our life. We just had a presidential election that was a referendum on like racist rhetoric and culture. Like we didn't have a political decision to make about people whose policies we preferred. It just wasn't like nobody knows what. The only thing anyone knows about Joe Biden, aside from the fact that he did whatever Obama did, is that like he isn't Trump, and that's all he ran on. And every single time a policy was introduced, he said, "I'm not going to do that." It was like a purely negative Medicare for all. Definitely not going to do that. Not going to talk about abortion. Not going to talk about anything that
Green
people
New Deal.
actually want. He says he'd supported a $15 minimum wage, but he didn't run on that. He doesn't support the Green New Deal. I mean, like we're literally in a political moment where there is this insane resistance to having a discussion about policy. And so political decisions are being made based on culture, or at least that's what it like it's hard to see what else is going on, is my point. So like in the moment that he's talking about, which is like where the working class is like the intellectual class and the media pundits and the people who drive public opinion in the public sphere, they're becoming separated from the working class. He's like, we have to try to understand culture better. This makes sense. In 2020, we're fully separated from the working class. I mean, like, we're middle class people for the most part, and we're having cultural debates with the top 20% of the population, and clearly we don't know what anyone else in the country thinks. This is a huge problem. So there's a way in which like being preoccupied with culture can obviously become self-referential, which isn't to say that like it's not possible to do working class politics or to talk about material conditions simultaneously, but the political moment that we're in puts into question, like you have to ask what is one's priorities? Is this particular set of priorities working for us? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I wonder if in this particular moment in the United States, in almost a really sort of reactionary way, culture has become bourgeois culture. How culture was understood as the very best of us. I'm thinking of kind of like what Du Bois thinks culture is, and at least early Du Bois, which is what the refined, it's what the very top do, and what people do on the lower tiers, well, who knows? We'll probably learn from like books like Hillbilly Elegy and all of that, which is supposed to give you some insight into what's happening in Appalachia. Yes, I am dunking on that book. And so it seems to me that I wonder if if Stuart Hall were alive today, he would and this comes up also what he thinks Gramsci is saying, that what is happening is actually it's a very weak culture because it's not elevating the debate to actually understanding. So what are the policy differences? He even has this line in the lecture somewhere, and I think Gil, you like this line, which is culture should be able to draw a line of fire in the sand, to be able to say this is the point of contestation. But instead it's almost as if culture has become so expansive and dominated by a certain set of social interests, where culture is about having more people on TV that look like X, or using the right lexicon or idiom, rather than, so how do the millions and millions of people in this country, how do they speak about these issues? How is it impacting them? But it's like we're in an echo chamber. And so culture has like almost completely cut ties with the political and economic sphere. And us as intellectuals are in many ways caught within it. Does that sound right? And so perhaps what Stuart Hall is trying well, no, he's very specifically about the 1980s. You're right, it's a very different political moment. And so maybe the question's different. Well, does this have use for us now? Or is this terrain lost in some sort of way and we have to go searching elsewhere? Because it seems you're right. Stuart Hall saw there's like this new terrain that's being opened wherein we can start having different fronts of struggle that can get different blocks of people organizing together to push back. But now, if like whenever you say culture, you're already caught in this sort of region of discourse that is rather ineffective, does that mean that we just leave it, give up on it?
So I was thinking about this in the context of like so I was thinking about like counter-hegemonic cultural struggle, right, or cultural politics as the sort of attempt to create a counter-hegemonic mode of thinking. And I think this is part of why, and maybe you all have a different read on this than I do. This is, I think, part of why so many people, like myself included, and folks on the left were as excited as they were about the kind of challenge presented by the Sanders campaign, right? Because what that was about, what that wasn't about, right, was like, so to speak, elevating the culture of like working class people in the country, but rather contesting the very framework within which people make sense of what's at stake in these political arguments, right? And so like the way in which the Democratic and Republican parties are both absolutely just, two wings of the pro-capitalist American party, right? Like the sort of challenge made by someone like Sanders and a lot of the, young DSA people who continue to just like, win elections and get people organized and working is that they have a different set of actually policy-driven prescriptions and thoughts about what the material organization of social life should look like. And that, for as long as I have been alive, and longer than that, was just totally absent from the whole of political discourse in the United States. And so this is the sort of thing that I think he has in mind when he talks about this kind of cultural politics being a condition for the possibility of like a political struggle. Not that it is, to invert our old bad superstructure base model and say, oh, now the economy follows from cultural representations in some way, but rather that there needs to be the formation of a new way of a different way of thinking than the one that is hegemonically dominant, especially under what for a long time looked like the total closure that neoliberal capitalism presented.
Mm-hmm.
Can I? Oh, and sorry, did you want to say something?
No, go ahead.
I was listening to this New York Times, the New York Times podcast. I was listening to this episode where they interviewed this Pennsylvania voter who was going to vote for Trump. And there was this one moment that really stuck out to me that it just spoke very loudly. I mean, there's lots of things that were said in the 30 minutes that they talked to this person. But there's the lead interviewer guy, and then he's got his journalist sidekick. And the lead interviewer guy is talking to this particular voter. He's asking him why he's supporting Trump. Fast forward a little bit. The sidekick asks him in this obviously disdainful way, don't you care that he's a white supremacist? And the reasons that this voter in Pennsylvania, he's a white guy, he says, look, I just feel like everyone has gone too far with that whole thing. I don't have any problems with anybody. I get along with my neighbors. There's this black guy, I go back and forth to work with him. We get along fine. There's no problem. And there's a way in which I listened to that, and the disdain just dripping from her mouth was crazy to me. And then I had to I was but I reacted to that too, because in the discursive universe that I'm a part of, just being oh, well, I know black people and I get along with them, in this kind of we go to work together. That's not anything that anyone is said. Everyone just assumes that in itself is racist. You know what I mean? And objectively that might be true, but this is his way of expressing his understanding of the problem. Mm-hmm. And he just doesn't see what this interviewer saw or what I have been educated to see or trained to see. I mean, and so the question is there's this cultural way of expressing things. I know people, I don't have a problem with them. And that is not going to satisfy the cultural elite. But how else is he supposed to express himself? And I just thought, there's something really off here. And this is the New York Times podcast. Everyone is hearing this. And so there's this way in which the interpretation of culture itself can become very elitist, which isn't the same thing as saying that what he's saying is somehow satisfactory. That is just good enough. That's where we want to end up in the world, as people being I don't have a problem with people. We would prefer to
we want a little bit more.
Do you see?
Yes.
Yeah, we prefer actual justice and equality and friendship and respect, and that's clearly not necessarily what he was saying. But at the same time, there's this tension between these expectations of these New York Times interviewers and this dude who just was not on their register, and because he wasn't ashamed of not being on their register, he wasn't trying to be, there was clearly this epistemic break between these people, and I thought it was fascinating. You could hear it over the interview.
I was going to jump in. Okay. Owen. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. No, I wonder because the New York Times is the kind of cultural gatekeeper of bourgeois culture, one of the major cultural gatekeepers of bourgeois culture, along the dominant culture, along with the New Yorker and in the Atlantic and those other publications. But I wonder if we could just shift the focus downward a little bit to something that I think interests Stuart Hall a little bit more than just those kind of higher gatekeeping levels of culture, to the existence or the absence of subcultures and countercultures. Like Jason Reed has an interesting take on why we're so obsessed with generations these days, because his claim is that we lack actually a vibrant play of subcultures and countercultures. So we identify with like Gen Z, millennial, boomer, and our identification, going back to this demographics point, right? A thoroughly abstract notion of culture that's kind of deprived of any vitality. And so I just wonder, like, looking around, like, how right is that observation? And looking around the U.S. today, or maybe not just in the U.S., but is that, to what extent is that true, and what does that say? How does that affect Stuart Hall's account of culture, right? Which he never really wants to talk about culture at that high level of analytical abstraction, right? He's always talking about cultures, and so I wonder. Or has the kind of project of cultural homogenization been like thoroughly successful, and has it eviscerated that play of cultures? I don't think so, right? But I love his descriptions, it's an edited volume, but his interest in like Rastafarian culture. If you want to talk about Black culture in Britain in the 80s, like you have to talk about Rastafarian culture. If you want to talk about white youth culture, you have to talk about punk, and how did white supremacy get infused with it in the age of thought, and ska, right? And how did Thatcherism and Reaganism change the character of those movements and make them, the disintegration of working class organization made those cultural movements much more racist and conservative. And I'm just interested in that kind of level of analysis, which is more, down in the, not the, and I appreciate you bringing that up, because that's the conflict, right, between the high kind of gatekeepers of dominant culture, and then ideally like a vital play of subcultures and countercultures. And I'm just wondering what you guys think is the state of play, as it were, with that right now.
Okay, so you've given me the opening to talk about my sort of pet peeve, and it is about how often, granted, I'm not on all of Twitter and all that, but I am firmly ensconced in what's called left Twitter, which is how to talk about Black political behavior in the South. And how often, I think it's deeply misunderstood. It's usually, so these Black people in South Carolina, they saved Joe Biden's campaign. It's either one because James Clyburn, this representative down there, duped all of these older Black people into doing that, or these people just don't know what's good for them. And I hate that, because we wouldn't accept talking about that way of other sectors of working class Black people and all of that. And so, attending to the fact that there is no homogenous Black South, but there is a lack of attention to detail. One, to the history of the Black church as a social form is still deeply important throughout large parts of the South as an organizing tool. That doesn't mean it's naturally progressive in any way, and certainly the Black church has been captured by what we call managerial interests, bourgeois interests, and all of that. But it seems to me you'd want to understand the history of how these people are understanding what they are doing by actually going there and finding out how they're thinking about these things. To find out, is it partially because, a lot of these people, their understanding of the United States is that the bandwidth is so narrow, might as well opt for the devil, I don't know. Are there conservative Black people? Obviously. Are there Black capitalists? Obviously. But it seems to me you're missing what Stuart Hall would say, you're missing a deeply fertile ground for organizing. You're already having a bunch of people in one place. You're already having them in a sense, talking about, discoursing on the world, that it seems to me that is a sort of what, if we want to call it a subculture, you're not going to find in the New York Times. At least the only way you'll find in the New York Times is through how movies present the Black church when they're doing.
The New York Times will
MLK.
tell you about. They'll tell you about the Democratic Party's souls to the polls, right? That's the only, there is party political engagement with those cultural sites, but it's really
every 4
basically
years,
the Democratic Party every 4 years busing everybody to a polling station so they can vote for a guy like Joe Biden.
Yeah, and
or you'll get like a moment of like pseudo cultural analysis in the New York Times where they send one of their intrepid Oberlin educated reporters to like an impoverished area that went for Trump and just like interview them, be like, wow, can you believe how these people live? And it's completely abstract and has nothing to do with actual understanding of like the complex dynamics within which political tendencies are formed, right?
Is this why
in these
people
like
have
diverse places?
Is this why people have so much trouble like finding out that they're like these super radical intellectuals and yet there are still Black people who don't agree with them, and then their like minds get kind of blown by that fact?
Yeah.
I do feel like that's happened. Like people who are like very on the left and like high intellectual spheres, like anytime like working class Black people or people who are just not plugged into their circuit, like just don't agree with them, they have to really like try to explain it in this way that I find like extremely neurotic and weird.
Well, look at that.
Like it's just they can't
neurotic, the neurotic frenzy right
like
now.
Like the facts seem to start to embarrass people, but they had thought that they had constructed this like very sophisticated like cultural analysis of Black political life. So like how could it be that people just don't see it my way? So then you have to like
Yeah, look at Joy Reid's neurotic breakdowns about on TV about how it's possible that Trump increased a little bit of his share of the vote amongst Black men or amongst Latinx men, and it's not just, I don't mean to single her out, but it's they have those panels on MSNBC where they just are really struggling.
What's the
trying
deal
to make
with
sense
Black
of what the hell
people?
I thought they all agree, right?
Like what is going on here? And so I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Owen. I just get really animated by these panels.
No.
And the endless questions. It's like, what are Black people thinking? Why aren't Black men voting at the same levels of Black women? Well, there are material reasons you can give for that. Disproportionately, a lot of them lost their voting rights in the prison system and all of that. But it turns them into this homogenous group that you have no sensitivity to. So what are the balance of forces going on there? And there's no ideological struggle to win that over. Jason
Johnson's one of the guys who's always on those panels too. I don't know if you've ever seen him, but he was the guy that attacked Nina Turner and Breonna Joy Gray and a number of the Black women that were working on that were leading and parts of Bernie Sanders' campaign. And he said that they're like from the island of misfits of Black women or something just incredibly stupid.
Yeah.
I did not see that,
clearly, Well, I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm not sure what you make of that, but
No,
making sure that like Black leftists like don't like are silenced is like a big part of this like project by the liberal elite in any case. Like Breonna Joy Gray has to be, she's not invited to speak on MSNBC or CNN, like never, like neither is Nina Turner. None of these people will ever be invited. And then like Adolph Reed had a conflict with some people in DSA, and then like it made the front, like the New York Times, in this like very negative and suspicious way. And so like anytime there are Black leftist like people who are just like not fitting into this like particular cultural box of like liberal ideology, it's like very important to silence them. And I find it, and the reason I thought about that is I was thinking about the people like leading Bernie Sanders' campaign. And then I remember when they just came after him for like not caring about like Black voters, not mentioning race often enough. And like there was like this whole spin on his campaign. And I remember thinking, what is going on here? Like no other candidate is being accused of this. And there's actually like a broader multiracial coalition for this candidate than like any other candidate. So what is happening here? And then it really relies on making sure that like ideological plurality like doesn't emerge, which really stifles political debate because it puts us in a position where we like can't have a conversation about policy, because now it's like if you want redistributive reform, like if you want wealth redistribution, well, you clearly don't care enough about race. And then it's like, well, ask the people who think it's both. That would be interesting for you to do. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking in this context about like what some of the things that Hall says about hegemony. Like he says things like hegemony is not a given state of affairs. It's a process, and it's something that's hard won and needs continually to be like enforced and reinforced, and its conditions need to be reproduced. And so like, and one of the things that he says, and I forget in which piece he says this, but that like the part of the problem that he's identifying again in the 80s, and we could talk about whether or not this is still the case today, is that like the right certainly understands this, right? And they get that like the project requires the continual establishment and reentrenchment of these hegemonic sort of, as he puts it, mastery over the discursive terrain, and like the modes of imagining or understanding what's happening in politics in a way that the left either doesn't understand or isn't doing as good a job at, right?
Yeah, I also just wanted to read a real quick quote from the 1983 lectures. Quote, "The aim of a theoretically informed political practice must surely be to bring about or construct the articulation between social or economic forces and those form of politics and ideology which might lead them in practice to intervene in history in a progressive way." End quote. Nice. And so I think, so much of what, I was raised like, obviously there are black leftists out there, but what, Gil and Lillian are talking about is that there's this constant suppression of this, the way that I think Hall would put it, this emerging sort of cultural politics, which again is not like the cultural politics we're critiquing, but what has happened is that the right has been so good at setting the terms of the debate that even sometimes like the left adopts those terms and tries to work from within them rather than actually doing what he calls with articulation, establishing a new common or good sense actually is his precise term for it. Common sense is like the incoherent ideas that are kind of floating around, they're contradictory, but intervening, bringing those together to establish a sense of something new that rejects the ways of framing the political issues that came before. And then things start to, I would imagine, start to crystallize differently. Medicare for all is no longer this crazy thing. A Green New Deal, which is a jobs program, again, is not outside the bounds of the respectable. And I imagine it can help you to start to win more people over to it. And I think that's so much of what Hall is about. How do you start winning a critical mass of people to be on board with this? And you don't.
Turns out shaming them isn't the best strategy for accomplishing that. It turns out.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's really unfortunate.
To being shamed, no.
People don't.
Well, I like being shamed, but that's like a personal problem.
Yeah, that is definitely not political.
Not political. It's not politics.
I know the personal is political, but I think not all like personal is political.
But you're exactly right, Will. And this is the sort of thing that I was like, it was shocking to me to read Hall talk about this in 1966, where having spent a couple of pages in the piece, like outlining what he takes to be the kind of dominant or hegemonic ideology in the United Kingdom. And it's what we today like call things like neoliberalism, right? Depoliticization, kind of like a cult of technocracy. What at the time he's talking about is like modernization. It's anti-conflict. It's like for compromise. Short-circuiting political movements. This like obsession with process over substance or like actual content. And then a couple of pages later, he's like, yeah, it would be bad enough if that were just like what the conservatives thought, but also the Labour Party thinks it and enacts it. And even some far left people think it and enact it. And this is the sort of thing that like, again, like reading that in 1966, I'm like, is he talking about us right now? Like, again, like you watch a debate between a Republican and a Democrat and I'm like, I could, if I squinted, I would think it was one person. It's bananas.
Yeah. And just one thing I want to say real quick, because I feel like I've been talking so much, but it's another thing in the political commitment essay that I think is so important, which is we need to resist for him the privatization of politics, where personal grievances are reduced to a disaggregate instances. So I imagine he's talking about things like you're not getting paid enough, but also your water is about to get shut off and you don't understand why you were fired or something like that. And it's made to seem as if these are disconnected things that are happening rather than, no, these are eminently political concerns that one can find their roots in the organization of social society. And so I also think that he's arguing for a form of ideological struggle that will be able to take what seem to be disconnected worries, gripes, struggles, and all of that, and giving them a frame by which they are, actually articulated together, by which you can say, oh, so this is what this is about, rather than why am I struggling for health care? Why does my landlord suck? All of that. And if you're not furnishing that, then it can seem as if, so I'm going to do these ad hoc piecemeal things to address those individual things while keeping everything fundamentally the same, which in the end does not work.
I feel like one of the my takeaways after after listening to this conversation and the kind of like problem with cultural politics we're having right now, is that there are no working class institutions to preserve cultural memory and to develop like a counterculture. And this is a problem of the New Left. Like, I actually think I'm of the developing minority position that the New Left has been culturally vindicated in a way that has precluded a sober analysis of its political shortcomings. And what I mean by that is its accepting of its separation from the working class, because that starts to emerge after the 1950s. Deindustrialization gets going. So by the time the 60s develop on college campuses, and there are exceptions to this, I mean, like for sure, but I mean, the kind of cultural politics that emerge are not connected to working class institutions, many of them at least, particularly the anti-war movement. So like there's this ossification of culture and ideology within a certain milieu. And actually I've started reading about SDS in the 60s, the Students for a Democratic Society, straightforward hostility to workers and like frustration with their cultures and with their concerns.
Their so-called backwardness.
Yeah, their backwardness. They're the kind of same problem Stuart Hall is talking about, this apparent conservativeness. But this is the kind of cultural tension we're having, that what is actually going on is a class politics, and the denial that has a class character. And I think what gets lost in all of this is that without working class institutions of many kinds, both trade unions is an obvious one, but when I think about an institution that was very successful, I'm like thinking about the SPD in Germany before the 1920s. So like it was the first social democratic party. This was a whole lifestyle for people. They had sports clubs, they had libraries, they had teams. I mean, like we're not talking about this like reductive economistic tradition. We're talking about people who really were lively, attuned to the cultural needs of their constituency. I mean, I'm actually not even sure there's been anything like it since then, but it's a very fascinating thing to read about. And without these kinds of institutions, there's nothing for like the middle classes and the elite to respond to, because these are ways in which people articulate their interests and needs. And so right now there's like no channel, and so it's easy. So if you talk about, we need to redistribute wealth in this country, it's easy to be like, well, that's reductive or something like that. But if you think about what it would actually take to get from point A to point B, we're not talking about just like an economic process. We're talking about people organizing themselves, getting to know themselves and each other, and articulating their interests. And that can't be just an economic phenomena. It's a social phenomena. And I think it's a mistake that the New Left made to start thinking in this dualistic way. And what I got out of reading these essays was, I think Stuart Hall, he saw that, and he's trying to resolve it at the same time that he's still just in conflict with it, because he's still trying to push the New Left project forward on very unfavorable terrain.
That's so interesting. And I was thinking, one of the things that I was like worried about, or like a worry that I kind of was in the back of my mind as I was like encountering Hall's thought here, and coming out of Gramsci, is like this question of like one of the critiques that was made for a long time of various sorts of like leftist and progressive political movements was the sort of inadequacy of this idea of consciousness raising. And there's like a whole series of reasons why we might think that that's an inadequate project. And I think he's very explicit about how part of what he finds so appealing about Gramsci, and I was also thinking too, Will, about what you were saying before, like the need to develop a totalizing worldview to unite these disparate features of what are otherwise disconnected political problems. And like I think this is part of why Hall is like from start to finish just like, no, I'm a Marxist and I'm doing a maybe more sophisticated version of Marxist analysis, precisely because it provides a comprehensive theoretical and political frame within which to make sense of all these different things. But one of the things he likes so much about Gramsci is that Gramsci just denies that there is a pre-given political subject, right? And so for him, the interesting thing is to figure out what are the conditions for the possibility, not of raising to consciousness a working class that already exists, right? But and part of the way that Hall will take this up, I think, is to say things like, you don't exist outside of the mediation through cultural forms that sort of suffuses in a given society. So how do we go about trying to intervene in that field, not to educate people about what they already are, but to constitute them, to allow for their constitution as this kind of subject of politics or of discourse. And so and
I think this goes back to what Owen was interested with the the subcultures and all of that, with talking about Rastafarianism and Scott. Obviously Stuart Hall, he's very explicit. He's not saying any cultural formation is never necessarily progressive and all that, which is why he talks about how a form of rock music that starts off as very sort of working class progressive gets hijacked by racism and all of that. So that's liable to happen. But what I think he's trying to say is, well, look how a new social formation could emerge, and you can find residues of it in music, because it's not just about music. I think that's what his point is. It's not just some people jamming together. It's people talking about very real issues that are impacting their lives and being transformed by it. And so it seems to me that what Hall pushes us to think, and I love in the Gramsci essay when he's talking about with Gramsci and Althusser, that there's a difference between the mode of production as an analytical abstraction, to be able to say, okay, so here are the economic terms, but it's never just the economy. Then you have to get to what he calls the multiple determinations in social formation. And from there, you can start to understand that there isn't just a pre-existing, the way to put it, subject or person waiting to be freed. There is the real possibility of a new arrangement of social and political life that can bring about a new state of affairs. And so partially the question is, so where do we start to go looking for those emergent and residual arrangements so that we can intervene?
Where do we start to build them?
Where do we start to build them? And which is, I guess, the question of institution. And so I also where do we start to build them? So what would it mean to develop new institutions? Maybe, that's, kind of the question that I guess Stuart Hall doesn't give us an explicit answer about, but it seems to me that institutions are deeply important because they allow for staying power of whatever this new subject is. It provides a home amidst the constant battery of the dynamics and relations of forces in a moment of crisis. But so what would it mean to start an institution? I mean, so what are the terms of the struggle? Is it to say, here's a room, y'all need to get in here, talk with one another, and hopefully you'll book another room, and then we have an institution? Or so what is the relationship of the people he's talking to, which is, I think, theorists and all of that? What role do they have to play in institution making?
I mean, I feel like it's very important for theorists to get comfortable being on the fringes of political struggle. I think that something unfortunate that happened after Stuart Hall in the cultural turn was because the terrain of politics was so unfavorable, and again, this separation from ordinary people that people experienced, which is not what the New Left did experience that separation, as I was saying, but there was still this kind of touchstone that they were referring to in working class institutions. So there's a way in which then the New Left got into the academy. They really started continuing to think about themselves as revolutionaries, which is profoundly bizarre. I read some of their work, and this turn towards discourse and language. I used to think people were exaggerating when they said it was a class politics, because analytically there's something true. As we were saying about ideology last episode, just because it's an ideology doesn't mean it's not hitting on something true. Like, I think Foucault had insights, you know what I mean? It's not blanket rejection, but this kind of like, even Foucault, like this massive turn towards language and discourse and so on. I actually, like, in my less sophisticated moments, which are many, I think that this is people justifying their own role, like in creating social progress and struggle. Like, if the main terrain is language and discourse, then I have a lot to contribute, because I'm like really good with language and discourse. It's something I can manipulate. It's something I can critique.
I know a lot of words. I have a thesaurus right next to me.
Exactly.
You can deconstruct a lot of stuff.
Oh,
yeah. So like the more I critique, the more it becomes this like, oh my God. You think I'm bad now? You wait. So like it becomes this like critique kind of is the struggle, and it's very narcissistic. And I feel like I can say this because I feel like I used to think that way. And then I got extremely alienated by academia, and I re-engaged politics like I had when I was younger, because I had been active in the anti-war movement and Occupy Wall Street. And then actually I went harder as a political activist during grad school than I ever had before, because by my second year in grad school, I was so alienated that I had to find an outlet outside of it. And that was like a culture shock. I'll never forget, I went to a political meeting about climate change. Somebody was giving a presentation about capitalism and climate change. I raised my hand and I said some weird shit about Foucault and neoliberalism. And they looked at me and I could just tell people were like, okay then. And like the meeting like went on. I never did that shit again. I did like a 180, and I haven't looked back from that since. So,
but doesn't but doesn't like Stuart Hall himself like try to give theory a more humble position than, you know, our kind of, I don't know, academic theorists who think that by deconstructing things or by analyzing discourse that they're doing radical work? I mean, he always uses this expression, which I really love, called, you know, the detour through theory. And he always like poses theory as something that, you know, it on its own doesn't really have a ton of agency, but it's useful to build it up as a detour through which cultural politics might go or through which political praxis might go. And I don't know, that might be one way to kind of situate theory in a way that makes it less, you know, we can have less pretensions about its power or less pretensions about its place in those struggles, whether they be cultural or political. So I don't know if you guys noticed that language of the detour and what you thought about it.
Yeah, I like that, and I did notice it, because it seems as if he doesn't think that theory in itself is revolutionary, but he likes historians like E.P. Thompson, because, you know, he's like, he did something new. Now all of a sudden we're talking like, oh, there was life there, and you know, it's not as if E.P. Thompson created that life, but he allowed it to, you know, to break out into a public way of speaking. You know, the terms of the debate are now different, and of course, you know, afterwards you can critique how those terms are set. But if anything, it seems to me that, you know, what, you know, Hall is saying is that, you know, what theory can win is, in a sense, you know, allowing what was there to have a new moment in the sun. So it can be, you know, it can be determined differently, and obviously, again, it's not a pre-existing subject, but it doesn't create out of whole cloth this new society. It does not create out of whole cloth this new subject. If anything, it only intervenes in a process that's already ongoing, but helps it gain, you know, just a little more legitimacy, a little more, you know, almost, you know, allows a little more epistemological insight into it, so that it's actually a coherent thing we can start talking about and start observing, rather than missing it and being completely confused as to what's going on. And that seems to me so much of what this is about. You know, Hall saying, you know, we need to stop at least being confused. That's what I love when he uses that.
We need to clarify the forces in the conjuncture.
Exactly.
Clarify what forces are at work.
Yes, that Marx quote of producing the concrete in thought, which is an ever ongoing process, but it is neither I think the beginning nor the end of politics.
I like that.
I like that too. I mean, I'm constantly sort of existentially moving around on this question, because I don't think theory is useless. I don't think philosophy is useless. Like I care very much about what I do, and surely I think I'm doing something. Teaching classes, putting material out into the world, making arguments, making an ideological intervention, if you will. And there's plenty of room for political education if that's something you're into. So like practically speaking, I think my contribution was mostly just to not inflate it, because I actually remember a time in which I didn't see a lot of avenues for politics, and that's when I went to a political meeting and that space was so alien to me. That's like the situation to be avoided, like where you actually start creating politics in your mind, and even if you have a materialist approach, that's the definition of idealism. You know what I mean? So that's
a great point.
Yeah, so like that's it. Even if you think that you are responding to like if your philosophical methodology is somehow materialist, that doesn't mean that like you're doing that all the time. And I think that being comfortable in your position as a theorist and kind of elevating the role of theory is dangerous. But like if you've got the right, if you find an equilibrium, then I think you should like be all in, like make your contribution. I think that can be totally productive.
Exactly. Well,
I like that account. Yeah.
That about does it for us today. Thank you for listening. There are going to be new episodes of What's Left of Philosophy coming out every 2 weeks, wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, etc. Please like and subscribe. Follow us on Twitter at LeftOfPhil. And if you like what we are doing, consider supporting us at patreon.com/leftofphilosophy. Thanks for listening.